Well, let's get more now on the Pope's Asia-Pacific tour with theology lecturer at the Australian Catholic University, Dr. Joel Hodge. Dr. Hodge, thank you for your time. Now, how significant a trip is this for the Pope and for the region?
Good morning, Gemma. It's a very significant trip. Pope Francis is going to the ends of the world in a certain sense. You know, in the European point of view, he's going from Rome almost as far as he could go. And he's looking to build really positive relationships between groups, help between Christian groups, between Christianity and Islam, and also to reach out to the margins, to go to, you know, some really poor countries. And it flags his kind of priorities.
And before we get into the reasons for the trip, we've just got to acknowledge it's a pretty exhausting itinerary, isn't it?
It is, and especially for an 87-year-old man whose health is not in the best shape. So it does show how important he sees this trip, and maybe perhaps one of his last overseas trips, possibly. So it's a very significant trip. And very significant for the people themselves. We've got to remember these countries are very religious countries, very different from Australia and Western countries that have become very secularized. Religion is so central to the life of Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and they are just going to have so much joy at the visit of Pope Francis.
Now, as we heard, interreligious harmony is a key theme of this, and the Pope touches down in Indonesia today, where Catholics make up a small percentage of the population. That's still a lot of people, though, given the population. Now, how will he focus on these interfaith relations while he's there?
Well, he's going to be visiting the National Mosque in Jakarta, and he'll go through that tunnel of friendship, as was mentioned in the clip, where that links the Catholic cathedral with the mosque. It's a beautiful sign, and it's actually modelled on a handshake. So it's a beautiful sign of interreligious relationships, and Pope Francis has wanted to emphasize those interreligious relationships during his pontificate, particularly between Christianity and Islam, kind of sibling religions in a way, believing in the same God coming out of Abraham. And he wants to build up those positive relationships, not just have tolerance, but actually really deep, meaningful relationship.
How important is Asia to the Vatican?
Well, very. I mean, it's the center of the church is really shifting out of Europe towards the developing world, towards Africa, towards Asia. Timor-Leste is proportionally one of the most Catholic countries in the world, like the Philippines. So you can see how important Catholicism is in the region, and it's growing in Indonesia, even though it's on a small base. So a very significant area, huge population, poor, marginalized, and so Pope Francis is very concerned with those areas.
Do you expect that he'll be pressed on controversial issues, and if so, what would they be? How do you expect he would respond?
I think he'll be pressed on interreligious relationships and what they mean, and that'll be an important part of the Indonesian trip, and the safety of Christian communities in Indonesia. Mostly a tolerant, really peaceful country, but there are incidents of violence, particularly towards Christian communities, and there are extremist groups. So there's that issue. There's always the ongoing issue of sexual abuse. It hasn't been as significant in these countries, but it is an issue that is always one that needs to be addressed across the globe. And so that might be one that would come up, and I think Pope Francis would deal with it very openly and honestly, as he's done in other places. And of course, there is the cost of the visit, but we have to remember Pope Francis is a major figure in the world, and any major figure who's going to go to another country, it's going to cost money, security, and event-wise. So we have to think about this, like for these countries like the World Cup or the Olympics, it's such a big event to have this singular global figure visiting their country.
What are the estimates as to the cost?
Well, I've seen estimates around in East Timor, for example, around 18 million, the government spending. And if we're thinking about, again, a major world figure, that's not unusual. It's that almost all the population of East Timor is predicted, or at least two-thirds, to go to the final mass, that the big mass that Pope Francis is going to have just outside of Dili. So it's going to be a huge undertaking, and the Timorese are just going to love it. Their faith is so important to them. It was so important during the Indonesian occupation. The Pope John Paul II's visit was so pivotal in the opening up of the country and the support of the country during that period. And it's just going to remind them of that, of the importance of the papacy and the closeness of the Pope to their struggles.
And so, Dr. Hodge, what will success look like for this trip for the Vatican?
Well, I think just having some really good meetings with Catholics is going to be these big masses, and it will show the significance of Pope Francis to the people, particularly to the ordinary Catholic. And I think having some really good meetings between religious groups or other Christian groups and political leaders, particularly in PNG, East Timor, and Indonesia, trying to build up those positive relationships so that we can have more peaceful, harmonious relationships between religious groups.